Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/OK Reading 4915, so credits to her. My encounter with a Wendigo. A few months ago me, 16, my sibling, 12, my friends D, 16, C, 13, and L, 24, were at a hiking trail a few miles from our house. The trail is 9 miles long with heavy woods surrounding the entirety of it. When you walk about a quarter of the trail, there's a bend where you can take a seat and look at the river. There's a small bench and a book people can leave messages in. We had walked to the bend and took a quick break. By the time we got there, the sun had started to set. You could hear the bugs all around you and hear the wildlife in the trees and bushes. After a few minutes we continued walking and made our way to the other side of the trail where there's a clearing. We walked down the dirt trail. On both sides there's ditches full of tall grass nearly 4 feet tall. About 100 feet from the trail is the woods we just came out of, and on the other side there's also woods, on private property. We keep walking down the trail and we get about 50 feet from the clearing when we all hear a man screaming from inside the woods. At first we couldn't make out what he had screamed, we just know we all heard it. We all stopped dead in our tracks and looked between each other trying to figure out what he screamed. Immediately after C says "What was that?" we hear the man scream again. This time it was very clear. We hear the man screaming, "Help! Help me! Help!" At this point we have no idea who this man is, where he was, or if he was even a man. A few seconds go by and L yelled back out to the man, "Hello? Do you need help?" We get no response. We stare at each other in disbelief for about a minute, wondering what to do. We discussed the possibilities of what it could be, wondering if it really was a man crying out for help or if it was something else. We decided to keep walking down the trail after it was silent for a few minutes. We didn't hear any more screams or yells, but we did hear heavy footsteps in the woods, something that wasn't human. On the walk out of the trail we took pictures of the trees and caught a pair of glowing eyes in a few pictures. We know these were not lighting bugs as they were all lower to the ground. The eyes were an orange-red color and far back, peeking between the trees near us. We took pictures every few feet and there would be the same eyes, following along with us. When we were near the end of the trail we heard the same male voice screaming something we couldn't understand. Nothing else happened on that trail and we have not gone back since. I've lost the pictures of the eyes, even though I know I saved them and put them in a folder. About a week later I was sitting outside around 3 or 4 a.m. when I heard a scream. The same scream we heard on the trail. It was the same man screaming for help again. My friend D came outside asking if I had heard it. They were inside next to the door about to come out. The man screamed over and over again. We heard footsteps getting closer to us and we decided it was best to go inside and lock the doors. We didn't talk about it that night as we were too scared it would get closer. We all believe we encountered a Wendigo. There's been a lot of sightings in the Great Plains, where I live. At first we thought it could have been a skinwalker, but we never saw an animal or anything that would be specific to one. We live in a big collage town. We think the Wendigo heard one of the collage students' voices and made a ploy for help to lure us in. We never investigated. We never went back. We never followed its cries for help. We were all worried that it could have been a real man in real danger. The following week we were all keeping our eyes out for news reports about someone drowning or being in some sort of accident on the trail, as it's a very popular place to hike. But there was never any reports made of anything. We all believe we encountered a Wendigo those nights. Second story. This story was shared by you/AshKi90, so credits to her. I will not be changing any descriptions that are compared to movies as to appease any skeptics who don't believe these accounts solely because the eyewitness makes a film comparison. Furthermore, all three of these incidents were told to me over the years from three very different people who have no connection to each other. I never shared the other stories I heard about this family to the person sharing their own account as to not influence their own memory or story. I just let them confide in me their own experience with this family. First story. I went to high school with a well-known, successful powwow dancer/competitor, and this was his story. He began dating this girl from a large family prominent in the powwow competition world. The parents of the large family were not employed and the father performed odd jobs around the community. Their main source of income was the monetary prizes and winnings from competing in powwows. Having a large family with no stable income resulted in them being low on the socioeconomic ladder. Being from a small rural res town, there isn't much to do for date night. So it is very common to drive around on old dirt roads and park and stargaze. One night he picks up the youngest daughter to spend time together. However, that night they opt to stay parked in his car on her family's property. Most Navajo families have their homes in small circular networks such as a cul-de-sac minus the paved roundabout. There is a derelict traditional mud roof hogan on the property. The roof was caved in, but the framing for the doorway was still intact. Oddly enough, there was still a raggedly old Navajo blanket draped over the doorway, lightly flapping in the wind. He says all of a sudden the dogs started howling and barking. They both stopped talking and stared at the dogs. Something had the dogs' attention. The dogs target their alarmed barking at the doorway of the old hogan. He feels uneasy but tries to hide it. She is still smiling and unfazed by all the commotion. The blanket stops flapping in the wind and falls flat. It's eerily silent except for the howling of the dogs. Suddenly, something rips through the doorway of the old hogan. As this figure exits the hogan, the dogs began to chase it. He told me it was a werewolf. He said it looked exactly how the Lycans looked in Underworld the movie, except not muscular. Like a sickly, emaciated werewolf. He said it takes about 3 long strides before jumping incredibly high straight into the trees. The dogs continue to chase it and cry off into the distance. He is in complete shock. He realizes that his girl's reaction did not match his. She seemed familiar or unafraid. In the moments following, he said she seemed to, for lack of a better word, tried to gaslight him. She began to tease him in an unfunny way and emasculate him by insinuating he was afraid. She said things like, "Ooh, you're afraid of skinwalkers." Long story short, they eventually ended their relationship. It was a very ugly split. He said her family was nasty, etc. He said he should have listened to all the other powwow community members when they warned him that that family was bad and they dealt in bad medicine. Second story. The older siblings of that family all shared residence in Phoenix. It is very common for people from the res to move to the valley after high school. The older siblings weren't any different. This story was told to me by another young Navajo man. Just like the first, he didn't believe in traditional values. He believed that SW, spiritual healing, medicine men, etc. were all myth. At the time he was dating the second youngest daughter. He expressed that her older brothers didn't like him and on many occasions tried to physically fight him. The SW family members were known partiers and on many occasions would throw res parties in the city, with all and most attendees being from the res. The older brothers despised him. However, he recalled that they would call a ceasefire, so to speak, during house parties. He said they would even be so kind as to even make him mix drinks or bring him beers. He didn't think anything of it. As nice as the brothers appeared, he still wasn't allowed to spend the night with his girlfriend under their roof. So after the house parties would dwindle down and end, he found himself behind the wheel of his car driving back to his own apartment. He would never remember getting into his vehicle, driving home, or getting pulled over. He believed he was just blacking out from the alcohol. I know it is very dangerous to get behind the wheel and drink and drive. Mind you, this is his story, and I'm only repeating what he said, and I am not condoning any of it. Him and his girlfriend loved each other, so he always returned to spend time with her. Fast forward to the next 4 house parties, and the same thing kept happening. He would spend the night in jail and rack up another DUI. Pretty soon he had 4 to 6 DUIs. He did time and paid the fines. He lost his job and his lifestyle. His mother, who was a very traditional Navajo woman and single mother, begged him to come home back to the res and get his life sorted. Without any other prospects, he decided to come back to the res. Upon returning home, his mother drove him to see a medicine woman. Feeling hopeless and lost, he thought, what could it hurt, right? If he didn't believe in it or it didn't exist, what is the harm? Nothing lost, nothing gained mentality. At least it would satisfy his mother's anxiety. He was shocked that by looking into the fire, the medicine woman told him in detail everything. He had never met this medicine woman before, or up until this point had never been to a ceremony. She told him that she saw him drinking and partying with SW. She told him that the alcoholic drinks they were offering him were laced with corpse powder. She saw their hatred for him. Their bad medicine was meant to be fatal. They were trying to kill him. She said had those cops never pulled him over each time, he would have continued on his way to his death. At the point of returning home, him and that girl had broken up due to his trouble with the law and troubles with drinking. Third story. This story was told to me by a gay Navajo man who had a long-standing, strictly platonic friendship with one of the brothers. They had gone to high school together and had remained friends in life. This happened at one of the aforementioned notorious res parties the SW family members used to host. The other brothers got upset and visibly angry that there was a gay man at their party. They wanted him to leave or else there would be trouble. The gay man told his friend that he would gladly leave to avoid any drama. However, he pleaded with him to stay and enjoy the festivities. The gay man was told to wait in the friend's room while the friend sorted everything out and calmed down his brothers. About 30 to 45 minutes passes. He decides it isn't worth the trouble and he is just going to leave. He walks down the back stairwell that directly leads to the garage. As he slowly and quietly descends, he begins to hear the brothers arguing. He stands silent and begins to listen. He can hear the familiar voice of his friend pleading with his brothers. He repeatedly hears his friend command his brothers not to fight him or put anything on him. On the res, any form of the phrase "put anything on him" / someone roughly translates to when someone witches another person. If someone witches another person, they put bad medicine on them. So the term "put anything on him" can only mean putting bad medicine or cursing. It's just common sense knowledge on the res. If you are not from the res, you may have many ways to interpret that phrase, but there is only one meaning on the res. He is shocked about what he hears and slowly backtracks up the stairs and finds another way out of the house. He leaves and never goes to another party there. It is said among the members of the small town that the powwow family are SW who curse their rivals in order to win powwow competitions. If you are from the res, I am sure you might have heard of this family or have even heard stories yourself. Third story. This story was shared by Sleepless from Sundown on Reddit, so credits to him. I joined the park rangers service right out of school and it was a perfect fit. I took to academics like a fish to the desert, and the outdoors always called. I passed my time in school daydreaming of the weekend and hiking or fly fishing with Pop. In the summer of '89, I was stationed in the Appalachians. Our jurisdiction encompassed trails leading all the way up the mountain. Up there the spruce thin out and clouds hang heavy even in fine weather at the base. I spent the summer clearing fallen branches from the walking trails after a couple of vicious storms over the winter. It was hack work reserved for the junior, but the truth of it was I didn't mind. The peak of the summer heat was spent and visitor numbers dropped as the weather began to turn. Persistent drizzle had kept me desk-bound for the morning, and we were about to get lunch when he burst through the door. He let out a moan and collapsed to the floor. Stanley leaned down and propped him in a seated position. Water dripped from his shoulder-length hair. His limbs hung limp by his side. I handed Stanley a cup of water. Stanley used his index finger to push down his chin. When the water hit his tongue, the man tensed and his eyelids flicked open. He flailed his limbs and knocked the glass from Stanley's hand. The glass shattered on the floor, but the man paid it no mind. "It is out there," he said. "What is?" The man half-turned and gripped Stanley's shirt and made balls with his fists. He repeated himself, pausing after each word. "It is out there." He started to sob. He released his grip on Stanley and buried his face in his hands. We lifted him onto a chair and he pressed his face against the table and bawled. I grabbed the rucksack he had dropped to the floor. On the bottom right was a name tag behind a plastic sleeve. Lenny Porter from San Diego. There was a number at the bottom. "I'll make the call," Stanley said. When Stanley returned, Lenny was sat up staring blankly at the wall with red eyes. His face was gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in a week. Stanley closed the door. "I spoke to your father." Lenny didn't acknowledge the words. He sat motionless and unblinking. Stanley shuffled across to where I was sitting and pressed his palms on the table. Lenny left San Diego 2 weeks ago with a couple of friends. They planned to spend a month hiking the trail north. The father gave me 2 names: Freddie and Sabrina. When he heard their names, Lenny leaned over and picked up his backpack. He rummaged frantically until he pulled out a stack of Polaroids. He flicked through the photographs and then slapped one on the table. Stanley and I leaned over. Flanking a fitter and healthier Lenny were what must have been Freddie, tall and wearing a baseball cap, and Sabrina, shorter and wearing a bright yellow top with an almost fluorescent blue belt pulling the fabric tight around her waist. Lenny fingered the photo and tears welled in his eyes. "What happened to them?" He sobbed and shook his head. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Stanley took a map down from the wall and pushed it in front of Lenny. "We are here. Where did you last see them?" Lenny blinked away tears and concentrated. He squinted at the map and pressed his index finger down and tapped it. Stanley took a pencil from his chest pocket and marked the map with a cross. "I'll notify the police. Get the truck ready to go." During training they told us about search and rescue operations. The Rangers are the first responders. It was part of the job. Twisted ankles and wandering off the trail and getting lost are not uncommon and no reason to get the police involved. But this felt different. I secured the gear in the truck and Stanley appeared, flanked by a police officer in his early 30s. Harry is hitching a ride. His partner will take care of Lenny. We drove up the trail for about 15 minutes with the truck until it grew too narrow and treacherous. We split up the gear between us and set out on foot. Our destination was high up the mountain and far away from the trails. It was almost as if the trails deliberately avoided the area. We hacked our way through the thick forest. How had they ended up all the way out here? Stanley checked his watch constantly as we climbed. He wanted to get there before dark. I figured we would be lucky if we did. Stanley and Harry talked like old friends, asking about each other's wives and children. The park rangers are in effect an extension of law enforcement. It made sense to be friendly with the police, and living in a small mountain town made it almost inevitable. I liked that. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Stanley checked the map. Almost there. Get your torches. All right. Harry reached into his backpack and pulled out a flashlight. I did the same. Do you know what's up this way? Stanley said. I shook my head. Somewhere up here is an old cabin. Hunters used it as a base back when you could still hunt up this way. The cross our friend Lenny put on the map is just about on top of it. Let's see if we can get there before there's no light left. We didn't make it by dark. Twilight gave the night with little warning. Soon we were relying on the light from our torches. Being on a trail in the sunshine lends a sense of security up here, even when you are alone. Now, surrounded by black and with the trail long behind us, an uneasiness grew in my stomach for the first time. Stanley paused and swept his torch. He muttered something under his breath. Harry took a few steps to the right, lowering his head and squinting. There it is, he said. At the farthest reaches of Harry's torchlight, the cabin emerged from the woods. Stanley tapped Harry on the shoulder. My eyes aren't what they used to be. The cabin should have been a source of comfort, but it only added to my unease. The roof was half caved in and trees encroached on all sides, gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. The structure looked like it belonged more to the forest than to man. The only door hung askew on warped and rusted hinges. 2 windows had long ago lost their glass. Stanley shouldered open the door with a grunt. Leaves and branches covered the floor, blown in through the open windows and roof. We dumped the gear inside. Stanley took out a lantern and tied it to a horizontal branch a few paces from the front door. He flicked it on and the light shone bright. If there was anyone lost nearby, they could not fail to see it. We split up and entered the forest, guided by our torches. Stanley instructed us to go no further than the reach of the lantern. It was our lighthouse on the horizon. The wind blew in fresh from the north. I buttoned up my jacket against the cold. The beam from the torch was strong, but aside from the narrow cone of light, the forest was a deep and full dark. Stanley and Harry called out the names of the 2 missing, Freddie and Sabrina. I did the same. Every few steps I stopped and listened. The forest was alive with the scurrying of animals and insects going about their business, and the constant rustling of the wind through the leaves. It was hopeless. This was needle in the haystack stuff. Freddie or Sabrina could be unconscious on the ground a few feet to my left and I would never see them. We should camp and wait for first light. Harry's voice cut through the night, louder and with urgency. I skipped towards the sound as fast as I dared. The 2 torchlights of Harry and Stanley played close together, the beams of light trained on the forest floor. You might not want to see this, Stanley said as I came up behind them. It was too late. By the light of the torches I saw him. Flat on his back, arms and legs bent at unnatural angles. I almost gagged when I saw his face. The left side caved in, a red, bloody mess fragmented with the white of the skull. The right side was intact, one green eye staring up, wide and unblinking. The remainder of the face had an almost serene expression. It was not the look of fear that you would expect from someone about to have half their face crushed. No skin remained below the neck, the contents of his torso picked so clean I could see his full spine. What did that? I stammered. I didn't get an answer. Stanley fished the Polaroid from his pocket and studied it under the torchlight. He handed it to Harry. It's him. It's Freddie. Harry jumped and swung his torch out into the woods. "I swear I heard someone talking out there," Harry said. "We've been calling out their names too." "No, it wasn't that. It sounded like whispering. It's the wind through the trees." Harry didn't look convinced. He called out the name of Sabrina and listened. Only the sounds of the forest. Stanley shushed him. "There's nothing we can do for the boy now. Let's get back to the cabin and radio down the news." Stanley took a few quick steps towards the cabin and motioned for us to follow. He seemed agitated. I didn't blame him. I followed on his heels. Harry lingered, searching the woods with his torch until he too fell in behind. The inside of the cabin felt like a sanctuary. Out of the wind and removed from the mangled corpse of Freddy, my mind processed the sight. I had gutted my fair share of fish, but this was different. I put my hand to my stomach and swallowed hard. I was overcome with a compulsion to repeat my unanswered question. What could have done that? Before I could, Harry gave us some more bad news. There was no response on the radio, only static. It wasn't surprising. The cabin sat in a depression between the peak we crested on our way in and the taller peak beyond. "We have to go back," I said. Harry shook his head. "Not in the dark and not when there's someone still out there." "We don't know if that girl is dead or alive," Stanley said. "I heard her." "You heard a whisper is what you said. And if she was there she would have come to the light. She'll come to the lantern and we'll wait for her." Harry threw out his arms in protest. Stanley sighed. "If she's dead then we'll find her in the light of morning. If she's alive and nearby enough to whisper in our ears then she'll come to us." Two rectangles of light shone through the open windows from the lantern outside, but the front room of the cabin still had dark shadowy corners. Stanley took a second lantern and tied it to an old light fixture hanging from the ceiling. The room lit up as if under sunlight, but a cold light that gave the room a bare and unwelcome feel. I busied myself clearing a space on the floor beside the black pot-belly stove at the rear of the room. Stanley and Harry stood as statues, staring up at the wall behind me. I turned. Etched in black soot onto the blank wall was some kind of monster. Long-limbed and with an elongated skull. It stared back at us through white blobs left clear of black. I took a step back and almost stumbled. "What is that?" I didn't need an answer. You don't live and work up in the mountains here without hearing the stories. Stories told dismissively by daylight, like you would talk about the monsters you imagined hiding in your closet as a kid. By night and around a campfire the stories take on a graver tone, and the name of the monster is only ever whispered. Wendigo. Of course I had never seen one. But if I had to imagine what one might look like, the painting in soot taking up the full height of the wall of the cabin was an exact match. I waited for one of the two men behind me to dismiss what we saw drawn on the wall. To make light of it and crack a joke. Neither did. Stanley uttered a simple instruction. No one goes outside without a weapon. Our shadows danced on the walls. The lantern hanging from the ceiling did not move. Stanley leaned and looked out the window. The lantern hanging from the tree branch swung back and forth like the pendulum of a grandfather clock. There was wind tonight, but not enough to do that. Stanley bent down and fished a rifle from the bag. My heart beat like a drum in my ears. And then something else. Whispers. What sounded like the whispers of a girl, entreating us, inviting us out into the darkness of the forest. Stanley inched open the door with the muzzle of his rifle. He stepped through the gap and watched the lantern on the tree come to a rest. He stood beside the lantern and searched the corners of the forest illuminated by the light. Nothing moved. Harry unclipped the leather strap on his belt and drew a pistol and went to the doorway. I took a step backwards, the Wendigo drawn in soot looming large behind and burning a hole in the back of my head. A shadow flashed through the trees and Stanley swung the muzzle of the rifle and shot, the crack piercing the night. He raised the rifle to his shoulder and flicked it from side to side, searching for movement. The lantern bobbed up and down. With a rush, a long-limbed creature dropped onto Stanley from above. He screamed and wrenched the rifle around, but had it knocked from his grip. Harry fired 2 shots and the creature let out a wail. It bounded towards the door and Harry slammed it shut. He pointed the pistol to the closed door and emptied the chamber. Harry took a step back and shot me a glance. Through the whole ordeal I had not moved. I had barely breathed. Was it dead? Was Stanley okay? The window, I screamed. The long thin fingers of the creature wrapped themselves around the inside of the window frame. Then the head appeared, uncannily human-like but distorted and disfigured. The chin elongated and the teeth like razors and drenched in blood. Its eyes white and piercing, just like the etching on the wall. Harry grabbed me by the arm and hauled me into the back room of the cabin. He slammed shut the flimsy door. The back room was windowless and the only light was a thin strip at the base from the lantern in the front room. We crouched together, our shoulders pressed against the door. We listened. The light patter of footsteps. 2 thin strips of black interrupted the strip of light at the base of the door. Something stood on the other side. "Come out, it is okay." It sounded like Stanley. Had he killed it? "Come out." Harry straightened and I grabbed his shoulder. "Don't open the door," I whispered. "They say a Wendigo can imitate those it kills." My hand brushed against Harry's back and knocked the flashlight from his jacket pocket. I fumbled in the darkness until I found it and I flicked it on. I scanned the room for something, anything we could use as a weapon. I walked away from the door and kicked at the twigs and leaves on the floor. All that was good for was kindling. Something smelled rotten. There must be a dead rat somewhere. "It's Stanley," Harry said. I pointed the torch to him. His eyes were wide and wild. He must have killed it. He smiled at me and took a step back. The door slammed open and carried with it the rotten stench. What stood in the doorway was not Stanley, but the Wendigo. Harry kneeled before it, breathing in the noxious fumes. I shone the torch onto the creature. Its gray skin pulled tight on a gaunt frame. And then something glinted. A belt buckle. Around the creature's waist was the bright blue belt Sabrina wore in the Polaroid. "Sabrina?" I said. It turned to me and paused, tilting its head to the side. I thought I saw a glimmer of recognition, a brief moment where it knew the name. But then it snarled, its mouth opening wide and dripping with saliva. It wrapped 2 hands around the neck of Harry and leaned in. I acted instinctively, without thinking. I jumped at the creature, swinging the only weapon I had, the torch. I brought it down on its head with all the strength and adrenaline I had. It bucked and sent me flying into the front room beyond. I threw out my hands against the fall and grabbed the lantern Stanley had hung from the ceiling. It could not bear my weight and the cord pulled out from the ceiling and I fell with a thud. I jumped up at a burst of warmth from my stomach. The lantern had smashed on impact and the white-hot filament broke free of its casing. I groaned in pain and the creature lumbered forwards. I retreated into the corner of the room and pulled my knees up to my chest. It stood over me and opened its mouth, razor-sharp teeth gleaming white. Then the smell of smoke. The creature hopped and then scrambled backwards. The leaves and twigs covering the floor ignited under the heat from the lamp filament. A small flame burst up and the creature covered its face. Fire. It didn't like fire. I crawled forwards and swept as much of the kindling as I could grab onto the flames. The fire grew and the creature screamed. As smoke filled the room, it coughed and spluttered. It made one last effort to come at me and then retreated out of the room and into the forest. I went to the back room and grabbed Harry. We stumbled out of the cabin, the fire now spreading up the walls into the roof. Stanley lay below the lantern hung from the tree, unmoving and with a chunk of flesh missing from his throat. We ran into the forest in the opposite direction the creature had gone. We first climbed up to the crest and then back down the mountain. We stumbled our way down by the light of the torch. Adrenaline coursed through our veins, and we imagined that thing right behind us, stalking us in the dark. When we finally crossed a trail, we followed it back down to the ranger station. A team of police and National Guard hiked up to the cabin after the sun rose. The cabin had burned to the ground, the pot-belly stove the only item that survived the blaze. The bodies of Stanley and Freddie were brought down. They said Stanley's flesh had been picked clean down to the skeleton. That was the first day of September, 1989. Sabrina was listed as a missing person and her father spent a month in the mountains searching for her. But she's gone in every sense that matters. Turned to a Wendigo by hunger for human flesh. She transformed into something unrecognizable from where it began. Around campfires, people still tell stories of the Wendigo. I don't know if they truly believe they are out there. But I know, I have seen it. Sometimes there really is a monster in the closet. Fourth story. This story was shared by Jennifer Rose Sundquist, so credits to her. This experience totally happened to me in January 2015. I didn't even know what a black-eyed kid was at the time. I was always a night owl, into playing video games, surfing the net and reading books well into the night. At that time, we were living in a three-plex condo, in the center unit. All of them were two-story, a few miles outside of town and sheltered in isolation just off the old highway. So it would have been really difficult for somebody to walk that far down to our development and know whose porch to approach. It was about 2 a.m. and it had been storming big time on the Oregon coast that night. The wind was whipping through the area and we'd had sideways rain going on for days. I was sitting in my room with a little stained glass lamp on, that wasn't much brighter than a night light. I was also burning a candle. The house was perfectly quiet and appeared to be asleep, except for me. That's when I began to hear our front screen door creaking. It sounded like it was being slowly and carefully opened. Whoever was out there at that time of night, in those conditions, seemed to know about the squeaky door and was trying to open it as quietly as possible, about an inch at a time. I kept listening for the sound, making sure it wasn't the wind. But I kept hearing a little hinge creak, and then another creak, until it was obvious that it was very deliberate. Whoever was out there doing this, knew exactly what they were doing. And for whatever reason, chose not to ring the illuminated doorbell right next to the front door. All of this was going through my mind in rapid, terrifying detail and freaking me out to the real threat that I was about to be confronted by a very bold intruder. I breezed around the corner of my room, which was on the bottom floor, closest to the front porch, and made my way toward the door. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew somebody was definitely out there. My husband at the time was sleeping upstairs and probably passed out cold. He was a doctor who was always on call and kept long hours, so I hesitated to wake him or get the police involved until I knew for sure what to report. I stood silently in front of the door, armed with my phone and a baseball bat, waiting to see what, if anything, would happen next. Roughly 2 minutes later, I saw the front door knob being turned slowly, like someone was trying to manipulate the door open. It was locked, but since whoever was out there had taken the time to quietly get that far, I felt pretty confident that they were about to take it much further. The old front door we had at the time didn't have a peephole. It just had this little bit of glass over the top of it that only a 7-foot-tall person would be able to look through. My only alternative was to look through a side 3-foot-long by 6 narrow window just adjacent to the door. I kept the lights off and slowly tried to move the little curtain just enough to peek out onto the front porch. As soon as I did, I was shocked to see a figure cloaked in a hoodie staring straight back at me. I was overcome with a feeling of dread and panic. At that point, I flipped on all the lights inside the house and yelled through the door, "Who are you and what do you want?" There was no answer. I repeated myself and asked, "Are you injured or is there someone I can call for you?" By then, it was at least 2:30 in the morning. There was still no response. So I ran around quickly and made sure the windows and back doors were locked. I also went to the top of the stairs to look out the hallway window to the parking area to see if there were any foreign cars or any other figures hiding out in the darkness. I couldn't see anything unusual anywhere. I ran back down to the front door and yelled, "I'm calling the police now." Finally, I heard what sounded like a woman in a monotone voice say, "I need you to open the door and let me in." I was dumbfounded and choking on fear, but I asked her why, what was wrong, and if she needed me to make a call for her. I asked if she was hurt, but I got no reply. So I informed her that my husband was home and sleeping upstairs. I told her I would wake him up and started yelling for him. She interrupted my shouts with a cryptic, robotic reply, "I'm not hurt. I need to come inside. I have something to give you." I was flipping out of my mind by now, but I pulled the curtains all the way back on the side window, turned the front porch light on and asked her to show me through the glass. She turned around and I could see that she was holding this perfectly coiffed, long-haired Pomeranian, wearing a beautiful, purple collar that had a gold, fancy medallion with the dog's name, etc., engraved on the front. She must have known that. At that point, she said to me, "I'm here to give you back your dog. Let me in and I'll give him to you." I snapped back, "That's not my dog, lady. Look at his collar. My dogs are right here with me." And both of them were sitting right beside me, standing guard, but keeping strangely silent. She said again in her creepy way, "I just want to give you back your dog." It felt like I was in the Twilight Zone on steroids. I said, "Look at the dog's tag. Where did you find this dog?" "That's not my dog, but I will make a phone call to its rightful owner if you tell me the number on the tag." I was becoming more concerned about the dog, being a devoted dog lover, and the fact that this disturbing person wasn't actually its owner. She didn't move, and I noticed that the dog she was carrying was being unusually still as well. It wasn't acting upset, anxious, or trying to get away from her. It didn't make any sense. It was the most peculiar situation I'd ever seen. But the feeling was ominous and dark. I started looking carefully at this girl so that I could give details to the police, in case she took off with the dog. I could see that she was a thin younger girl, possibly a late teenaged girl. She had straight, dark hair, covered by the red hoodie she was wearing, and a dark pair of blue jeans on. It was impossible to see her eyes. I reached into a nearby coat closet for a flashlight. Just then she said, "If you would just open the door and take a look at the dog to make sure it's not yours, I'll leave." I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, held my phone tightly, and walked back toward the door. My dogs never moved. I figured I'd take a close look and slam the door if I had to. I figured if she was unarmed, I might have a chance of grabbing the dog and getting him to its rightful owner. So I said to her, "I've got my phone and I'm ready to call the police if you try anything. Step back from the door and I'll take a look at the dog." I pulled the front door open slowly and took a long, careful look. The dog appeared to be exceptional and perfect, like it had just come from winning first prize at an AKC dog show. It was obviously someone's prized pet and not just a stray dog she found, or one I'd ever seen around before. I told her it wasn't mine, again. As I did, she took one step toward the door and I noticed she was holding something in her left hand behind her back, while her other hand supported the full weight of the dog. She kept looking down at her feet and remained silent. I asked her to put the dog down. As I said that, she glanced back toward the road and the parking area. But I didn't see anyone or any cars there. I asked her again to put the dog down and leave the front porch area. I said I would let the dog in as soon as she did and would get it back to its rightful owner. At that point, she looked up at me and seemed to stare right through me with her cold, dead, penetrating eyes. I have never seen anything more bizarre in my life. Her eyes were jet black and her hollow stare was fixated on me, like I was being examined or called to some kind of a challenge. My hands were trembling and it was all I could do not to throw up. She didn't seem drunk or on drugs of any kind. She seemed surreal, and in my mind I kept thinking of the Grim Reaper. I was hearing the words to the Lord's Prayer and struggling not to make eye contact with her. There was something very unnatural and menacing about her eyes, her intensity, and her odd, calculated, cold behavior. I couldn't figure it out. I shut the door and started screaming for my husband to come downstairs. He finally came down. I yelled to him, "Hurry! There's somebody standing on the front porch. She's got someone else's dog. She keeps saying it's mine. I think she's carrying something behind her back. There's something very wrong with her. Be careful." I called 911 as he opened the front door. But she was already gone and there was no sign of her anywhere. We even got in the car and drove around. The police couldn't find her either, and they couldn't find any reports on a missing woman or a missing dog anywhere in the state. The incident haunted me, so I decided to research lost pets with that description and any reports of women or girls like her in the area that might have been reported or listed nationwide. But I couldn't find anything. Curiously, the only thing that kept coming up was a new sighting of the so-called black-eyed kids in the Portland, Oregon and North Coastal area where I was living at the time. I'd never heard of anything like that. But when I saw the pictures that other people had posted and read some of the similar, chilling reports, my heart froze. She looked exactly like that. I don't know what else I could tell you. But I'll never forget it. I'm not sure what her purpose was. But I feel like she targeted me because of the fact that I was isolated and known for having my dogs with me everywhere. I would do anything to protect a dog or a helpless animal. Somehow I think she knew that. But it'll always be a creepy mystery. Fifth story. This story was shared by u/jokes0nme, so credits to her. Wendigo encounter. So I don't really know how to start this, so I'm just gonna spew out some stuff and hope it all makes sense, because it sure as hell doesn't to me. Have any of you even encountered one before? If not, let me tell, these things are not like how Google or any of pictures you find depicts them, at least not right away. Let's get into it. I'm from Canada, and I live on a reserve that's about 30 minutes from any town, relatively close compared to other places I've been. Well, it's the end of December and just getting finished with holidays and spending it relatively alone, thanks to COVID. I get a call from one of my friends. He wants to go hunting. Well, that's kind of a problem because I've never shot a gun or went hunting before. Pretty pathetic for a Native American if you ask me, but anyways, he tells me he just needs my eyes and another set of legs to help carry whatever he catches. So I agree, making one of the biggest mistakes I would come to regret. So he picks me up in his crappy old Ford truck he uses for hunting, tells me we are going deep into the bush and we'll find a spot to camp along the way. So we drive about 20 minutes into the woods following what little road is left, and we get to a point where we have to continue on foot. We unload our gear and supplies and carry it till we find a nice clearing with room for everything. After we set up camp, we begin our trek into the woods, going farther than I had gone before. Saw a couple of bucks and rabbits, nothing too spectacular, so we keep looking cause he wants the big daddy buck, and we come to this other clearing much larger than the one we are camping at, and something about this part of the woods just feels off. It had a heavy feeling to, like the air was thick, and just had a disorienting aura about this place. But we hadn't caught anything yet and were getting hungry, so we spot a rabbit in the middle of this clearing. Buddy lines up the shot and bam, we have dinner. So being the one without the gun, I go to get our little dinner in the middle of this clearing, and I notice something odd, that it's a perfect circle. No tree stumps, no sign that any human had made this gigantic circle. I also happened to notice what looked like claw marks on the trees surrounding the area. Buddy said it's from bears sharpening their claws and marking territory, but the marks were so deep into the trees it seemed off. Anyways, it's dark out now and we are back at our campsite eating and talking about how crazy this pandemic shit is. I also brought up the clearing we were at and how weird it felt to me. I wanted to know if he felt like that too, or if I was just exaggerating. My anxiety makes me do that sometimes. To which he said yeah, he noticed the change in the air too, and said it made him feel dizzy and worn out, but he also said it just could have been from the long day we had. So on that note, it was time for bed. We both slept in same tent. It's the middle of winter and bundling up can only do so much, plus he was like a brother to me, so not a big deal. It had to be around 1 a.m. when we both woke up to sound of the most horrible scream I'd ever heard. What that fuck was that? Was my first though. I'm guessing my friend was thinking the thing as he looked at me with fear on his face. I know, because I was afraid too. So he grabs his gun, loads around, and we just sit there for a while and listen. Now I know my friend is at least safe, he's got a gun, but I have nothing. Fear and my anxiety start getting the better of me, so I ask where's the hatchet we used to split wood. Out there by the fire, he said, so I tell him I'm gonna open the tent, grab the hatchet, and when I jump in you seal the thing back up. I open the tent and as fast as I can bolt out to grab that hatchet. As I go to turn around with hatchet in hand, I'm quickly greeted by my friend shoving me down by the back of my neck. He put his finger up to his mouth to tell me to be quiet, and we listen. In the distance I can hear the slow sound of crunching snow and a faint high-pitched guttural growl. Now I'm in full panic mode. We don't even have to say anything to each cause we both know our hunting trip was over and it was time to leave. All we had to do was make it to the truck, in the dead of night. It sounded so easy. But it was not, and I knew that from the moment my friend said, I'm gonna fire a warning shot. But before I could even open my mouth to tell him no, it was too late. The shot rang in the distance, and for a moment there was silence. Then we heard it, a scream so soul-piercing it felt like it lasted forever. It definitely echoed much further than this gunshot did. It was petrifying. I'd never heard such a haunting scream before that. I was literally frozen in fear. Then we could hear whatever made this scream was charging right for us, with the sound of crunching snow getting closer and closer. We looked at each other and just ran in the direction of the truck, frantically sprinting, calling out to each other to make sure the other hadn't fallen behind. We're almost there, we kept telling each other as we were weaving through trees, making a beeline to the truck, trying to ignore the sound of this growl that sounds like it's right in my ear. But I can see the truck, we're gonna make it, we're getting out of here. As we come up to the truck, my friend makes it to his side and unlocks both passenger and driver's side at the same time. As I open the door, he does too at the same time, and then he's gone in a flash of white. This thing had gotten him, ran at him with such force that when it tackled him it shook the truck side to side. I stood there in shock. I call out to him, but all I can hear are screams and a couple gunshots, and then dead silence again. I know in my heart that my friend is dead, and so am I if I don't get the fuck out of here. I go over to the driver's side and find the keys on the ground. He must have let them go when he got tackled. I hop and start the damn thing, whip it around in the direction I need to get out of here. Then I saw it. Skin as white as snow, completely hairless, eyes that had sunken into its head made dark circles around the eyes that were just as white as its skin, no nose, teeth so jagged and sharp shined with the color of blood, and its lips looked like they had been chewed off, so all you're staring at is teeth. Its body was so disproportioned, but with long lanky limbs. This thing is blocking me from leaving, but I'm getting out of here no matter what. I floor it with the tires spinning. I shoot forward, and so does it, screaming that blood-curdling scream as it charges at me. Now I'm getting up close and personal as this thing lunges at the truck and bounces off the hood and over top of the truck. As I'm speeding away, I glance at the rear-view mirror and witness this thing get up and just stand there watching me drive off with its head tilted slightly. I knew I had just escaped death with the price of losing my friend. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.